The isolated town of Darrow Hill, nestled in the wild hills of Maine, has a history of strange disappearances. But over time, the residents have largely forgotten about them. Now, only a few elderly residents remember the eerie calls of crows that emanate from the Old West Cemetery, which was once the execution ground of a mental asylum more than 70 years ago. That evening, Natalie, a psychology major, returned to visit her grandmother. The house was located next to an old cemetery, where she had lived alone since her husband died. On the way into town, Natalie noticed something strange. The sky had suddenly darkened at 4 p.m. Crows were flying overhead, and her phone's GPS was erratic even though she was on the right track. She stopped at the curb near the rusty iron gate of the cemetery. Just then, a long, drawn-out call of a crow made her shiver. A shadowy figure passed by her rear-view mirror, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. Natalie's grandmother, Mabel, greeted her anxiously, muttering something about Saturday the 13th, the day when the spirits call the names of the living to lead them to the afterlife. She said that every time the seasons change, the crows would cry out as a warning. Whoever heard the call, someone in the house would die within 3 days. Natalie, with her college-age logic, thought she was just being paranoid. But as the night wore on, she began to hear knocking on the door, footsteps in the empty hallway, and crows cawing at her window. The first night at Darrow Hill was not as peaceful as Natalie had hoped. The wind whistled through the old windows, each whistle sounding like something screaming from a void. Mabel was asleep, but Natalie kept tossing and turning. Around 2 a.m., she heard footsteps, not hurried, but slow, as if someone was circling the old hallway. She opened the door, the dim yellow light from the hallway light flickering, as if it was about to go out. No one. But when she returned to her room, she saw the window was wide open. The curtains were fluttering in the night breeze. Natalie was sure she had closed them before going to bed. She stepped back, about to close the door, when a pale hand grabbed the edge of the door frame. She screamed, but there was no one. When she poked her head out to look, a figure in a black coat stood right in the yard. His face had no eyes, no nose, just a blur of white skin. He looked at her with emptiness. Natalie slammed the door shut, locked it, and rushed toward Mabel's room. She was sitting on the bed, eyes unblinking, mouth muttering something. It chose. It smelled blood. She shook her, but she did not respond. Just then, outside the window, a flock of black crows landed on the iron fence, screeching with terrifying sounds like human screams. The next morning, Natalie called the police, but they came, checked around the house, and of course, found nothing. The police chief, Mr. Dean, said, "Darrow Hill has many legends, but most of them were made up by locals to scare children." Natalie didn't believe it. She turned back to the room, and this time, she noticed mud prints on the floor, stretching from the window to the corner of the room. She opened her phone and checked the security camera in the yard, and installed it because of the rat infestation. The footage from 1:58 to 2:12 was completely grainy. But at the end of the clip, a 1-second frame flashed, a faceless figure standing under a willow tree, staring at the camera. Natalie couldn't sleep again that night. The images of the faceless man still haunted her. She decided to find out the truth, not out of curiosity, but because she felt like she was being chosen by something that didn't belong in this world. The next morning, she drove to the Darrow Hill Town Library, where the old records were kept. There, she met Mr. Edward, the town's oldest librarian, who had lived there since Darrow Hill was a correctional facility for the criminally insane. At first, he refused to talk, but when Natalie mentioned the faceless man in the Western Cemetery, his face turned pale as if he had just seen a ghost. It was Wilmer Crane, a serial killer, but no one knew how crazy he was until it was too late. Edward said that in 1948, Darrow Hill Correctional Facility held a particularly dangerous man, Wilmer. He did not speak, did not smile, just stared at everyone. But every full moon, a nurse disappeared. By the time they discovered it, 7 people had died. When he was executed, Wilmer did not say a word. He only glanced at each person present that day. After his death, all records about him were torn apart, as if he had never existed. Natalie asked, "Why is the cemetery located next to my grandmother's house?" Edward swallowed, "Because that is where his body is buried. Those who live nearby will one day hear crows calling his name." Natalie stiffened. Last night, she had clearly heard something outside her window. Not just a scream, but someone whispering her name. Not Ellie. She immediately returned to her grandmother's house. At that moment, Mabel was burning something made of dry leaves in the backyard, an ancient Native American ritual. She said, "You've dug too deep into the darkness. Now it knows your name." That night, Natalie couldn't resist sleep. Her eyes kept closing, even though every nerve in her body was tense with fear. She locked the door, closed the windows, left the nightlight on, and even placed a pair of scissors next to her bed as a last resort. But while sleeping, she fell into a strange dream. She was standing in a foggy cemetery. The sky as gray as ash, no sun, no sound. Everything was so quiet she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Dilapidated tombstones were scattered around her. On each one, there was only one word engraved: "Choose." No name, no date of birth or death. She walked away, and after a while realized she couldn't turn back. Every time she tried to look behind her, her head felt like it was blocked by an invisible force. She heard footsteps, distant at first, then closer. Someone was following. Natalie wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck in the mud. She screamed, no sound. A cold hand grabbed her shoulder. She turned around. A blank face faced her, Wilmer Crane. His skin was as smooth as a wax mask, but his mouth was starting to tear, as if someone had torn it open with a knife. From his mouth came a sound, a hoarse, distorted sound. "You have heard the name. Then you belong to me?" Then he opened his mouth, not to bite, but as if to swallow her. A black hole filled his throat, and a scream came from the ground. Dead hands rose from the ground, grasping her legs, pulling her down. Natalie struggled, screaming silently, until a loud call tore through the air, and she woke up. She sat bolt upright in the dark. Sweat covered her body. The clock read 3:33 a.m. The window was wide open. The scissors beside the bed were gone. Natalie gasped. She stood up, turned on the light, and saw on her pillow, scrawled in black ink, "Select." The next morning, Natalie woke up feeling as if she had just escaped death. She stared at the word "choose," still clearly printed on her pillow. Her hands were still shaking. Deep down, she knew one thing. This was not an illusion. She rushed to Mabel. When Natalie told her about her dream and what happened at 3:33 a.m., the old woman didn't say a word. But after a few minutes of silence, she opened a cupboard and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was an old, yellowed photograph of a woman in her 30s, her eyes wild, her hands bandaged, her mouth torn as if she had just survived a brutal attack. "Her name was Lydia Shaw," said Mabel. "She was the only one who ever survived Wilmer's choosing. But the price was not easy to bear." According to Mabel, Lydia was a nurse at Darrow Hill Prison in 1948, where Wilmer Crane was held. After a string of staff members went missing, Lydia was the one who discovered Wilmer standing in a locked room, his hands covered in blood, with a human tongue in front of him. Lydia was transferred out of the camp shortly after, but just a week later, her family was killed, Her husband, 2 sons, and even her cat and dog had their tongues cut out and were hung upside down from the ceiling. Lydia survived only because she was not home that night. Mrs. Mabel bowed her head. She lost her mind for a while, but then someone, an Indian named Elias, kept her alive. He knew how to capture the spirit. If you can find Aunt Lydia, maybe she can help you. Natalie investigates and discovers that Lydia Shaw is still alive, being cared for the Forest Pines nursing home, more than 50 miles away. She drove there immediately. Forest Pines nursing home was a dark, old place with long, narrow hallways and dim fluorescent lighting. When Natalie asked about Lydia Shaw, the nurse seemed hesitant. She hasn't spoken to anyone in almost 20 years. She just sits in her room, draws, and looks out the window. Every night, she screams at exactly 3:33 a.m. Natalie walked into room 106. Lydia sat with her back turned, drawing a charcoal drawing. She turned to look at Natalie. Her eyes seemed to pierce her soul. Without needing Natalie to explain, the old woman softly said, "It called your name, didn't it?" Natalie nodded. Lydia smiled faintly, a smile that was both pitying and desperate. "It doesn't want to kill you. It wants to take you away, to take your place. Wilmer's soul is restless, and it needs a substitute to get out of the grave." Lydia reached out, pulled Natalie close, and placed a wooden necklace soaked in wolf's blood on her hand. On the necklace was engraved a strange symbol, a crow circled in a crescent. "If you want to live, you must go to the black apple tree behind the cemetery, where Elias once sealed his soul, before dawn on the 3rd day, or he will take your place forever." She stepped back, her eyes lost in another world. 3:33 is the hour when the door between life and death opens. Then he walks out, and you will never come back. Natalie drove through the night fog, the heavy necklace around her neck burning her skin. The clock read 2:48 a.m. She was racing against time. The road to the cemetery was eerie. The GPS signal was dead. The radio was a mix of whispers and crows. The tires seemed to run over something soft several times, but no body was found. When she reached the edge of the forest, she turned onto a small path where Mabel had once spoken of the black apple tree. No one could remember when it had grown, only that it bore no fruit, did not shed its leaves, but always had blood flowing from its trunk. Before Natalie, a giant black apple tree loomed out of the mist. It towered over all the others, its branches twisted like the hands of a dying man. A deep fissure at the base of the tree, from which oozed a thick, black liquid that smelled of death. She approached. The necklace began to beat with her heartbeat, burning hot. Suddenly a loud cawing sound came from above. On a branch, Wilmer Crane squatted. His eyes were white, his teeth were jagged, his arms dangling like a monkey's. From his mouth, a long tongue protruded, red and cracked like a piece of dry buffalo hide. "Here you are," he hissed, his voice like iron scraping against stone. "Ready to trade places with me?" Natalie stepped back, her hands shaking, but she remembered Lydia's words. "Don't run. We have to force him back underground." She pulled out the ancient paper Mabel had given her, a sealing ritual written in the native language mixed with blood. Though she didn't understand it all, she knew what was needed. Wolf blood necklace, blood of the chosen one, 3 salt rock rings, a fire from black apple wood. She cut her wrist and dripped blood onto the ground, sprinkled a ring of salt around the base of the tree, burned the small pile of firewood she had taken from the apple tree that afternoon. Crows began to screech chaotically, hundreds of them blackening the sky, forming a vortex above like a soul-sucking portal. Wilmer screamed and charged. Natalie shouted the first spell, and the flames turned moss green, starting to suck black smoke back from Wilmer's body. He writhed, his fingernails scratching the ground, his face contorted, and his tongue fell to the ground, wriggling like a snake. No! Wilmer screamed as the collar burned, making a sound like 1,000 people whispering at once, and his body began to shrink into the earth. From deep underground, a giant skeletal arm rose up, grabbed him, and dragged him down into the pit of blood. At the same time, a gray wave poured out from the ground, blowing away all the crows. The salt ring dissolved, the fire went out. All returned to absolute silence. Natalie collapsed, her head spinning. When she opened her eyes, it was already dawn. The black apple tree was still there, but the crack had closed. No more blood, no more crows, only the collar, now cracked in two. After that night, Natalie thought everything was over, but she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the sound of crows cawing echoed in her head. She began to hear whispers from the base of the black apple tree, even though she was miles away. A week later, Mabel died suddenly in her sleep, clutching an old map. Natalie was invited to the funeral. When she arrived at the old woman's house, she was given the last map her mother had wanted her to have, a hand-drawn map leading to the woods west of town, where the old 17th century cemetery had once stood, but had been erased from local records in 1912. That night, Natalie couldn't resist the urge. Something was pulling at her mind. She grabbed her map, flashlight, and went into the woods alone. Evergreen tree, in the forest. The scenery became more and more unreal. The trees seemed to twist with each step she took. The smell of dampness mixed with the smell of raw flesh. She walked through the mist until she reached a mossy clearing where there was an unmarked stone tomb. On the stone surface, there was only the symbol of an eye carved deeply, surrounded by 7 raven wings. As soon as she touched it, a cold wave rushed up her spine. She felt herself falling into an ancient memory, a town in the founding era where people performed autumn sacrifices. And Wilmer was not the first, but only the latest, to be possessed by the demon to carry out this cycle of killing. The demon was named Corvus Tenebris. The Raven of Darkness, an ancient entity from pre-Christian Europe, brought by devout believers fleeing to the New World. They hid it underground, tied to a black apple tree, hoping to seal it with a blood ritual. But after each generation, if there is no one to keep the seal, Corvus finds a new host to take over. And Wilmer is just one missed seal. Back to reality. Natalie backed away from the tomb in horror, but flames suddenly erupted around the area, forming a burning eye. From underground, a loud thud, like claws scraping against a coffin lid, echoed. She tried to run, but the ground felt soft under her feet, as if something was rising up. A black crow arm as big as a telephone pole, its feathers covered in blood, reached out from the ground. It was neither human nor bird. It was Corvus, not yet fully formed, still searching for a host. "You called me," the voice echoed in her head, many voices at once, like hundreds of souls screaming. She pulled out the silver knife, the last relic Mabel had left her, and cut her palm, dripping blood onto the grave. Blood at the ground shook, but instead of being sealed, she felt a part of herself being sucked down, as if her blood was merging with Corvus. Brain Natalie's mind began to crack. Back home, Natalie was no longer herself. She couldn't sleep for 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw hundreds of crows staring at her. She began to draw crow symbols all over the walls, written in blood. When relatives came to visit, she would mumble, "It wasn't me. I was just a shell. It saw me." Natalie no longer knew what was real and what was imaginary. She wandered around town like a sleepwalker. Everything was turned upside down in her head. Familiar faces were now distorted. Everyone's eyes were empty, as if their souls were being sucked out. The only person who could still contact her was Jared, the police officer who had investigated the Wilmer case years ago, now retired due to mental illness. He came to her with a crazy look on his face. "I know it's not dead. I saw it under the apple tree. It spoke to me in my wife's voice, even though she's been dead for 8 years." Jared gives Natalie an old diary containing the entire 1984 case file that the authorities had hidden, an ancient tattoo that all possessed hosts have, the symbol of a raven's eye with a circle of fire. Natalie went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. On his left shoulder, the bruise from the recent accident has slowly turned into that tattoo. Face screaming in fear, the final nightmare. That night, she dreamed that she was nailed to a stone pillar in the middle of the forest, surrounded by black crows flying in a whirlpool, blood dripping from her eyes to the ground, a giant apple tree growing from the ground. On top of the tree, a creature as big as a house sat, covered in black fur dripping with blood. Its face was 100 screaming faces. "You will be my eyes, my mouth, my hands." She woke up with bleeding fingers. She had unconsciously drawn the entire devil symbol on the bedroom wall. Fire final decision. Unable to let herself become a second Wilmer, Natalie prepares the final ritual. Using Jared's own diary and the ancient sealing tools recorded in the map, the western forest floor was where Corvus was first sealed, and she had to burn herself there, in the middle of the blood mark, to break the host bond, an act of sacrifice or madness. In the middle of the forest, it started to rain, but Natalie had set up a tent, poured a salt circle, drawn an ancient symbol with blood, lit a fire, and sat in the middle of the circle. Corva's voice screamed in her head, "Fool, you think fire can kill me? I am the fire creation. I live in fear." The fire flared up, but instead of pain, Natalie felt light. She found herself falling into a deep black abyss, but at the bottom there was no hell, but images of her childhood, her mother's lullaby, laughter. Then suddenly everything went dark. New moon 1 week later. Police found Natalie's charred body, surrounded by a ring of burnt salt, at the foot of a black apple tree. The apple tree bears no fruit now. Crows no longer fly around the woods. No more whispers come from the ancient cemetery. The town returned to normal. ! But a little boy wandered into the woods, put his hand on an old apple tree, and smiled. "Mom, I had a dream about a talking crow. It said it was lost, and it wanted to go home." The screen went black. A crow cawed. "Run out of